Thank you, Will. You are a legend, it says here. And hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. No, not happy, actually. I'm relieved to be here without getting lost. I have a bit of a habit when I'm going to places that I haven't been before of getting lost. I have a hopeless sense of direction, and I was always rubbish at geography. In fact, it was a standing joke in my family that I failed my geography O-level because I got lost on the way to the exam. But I prefer an alternative explanation. I prefer to blame it on my teacher. Say I had a rubbish teacher, because do you do that? If you're no good at something, do you say, oh yeah, I had a supply teacher, I had a rubbish teacher in that subject? And I was talking to a friend about this last week, and his name's Jonathan, and he told me that he had, I was envious, he had the most brilliant geography teacher. He had this, he had this teacher that geography started off, the boys would turn up. This was back in the 70s. Boys looked like this then, didn't they? Well, my boyfriends did. And the boys would turn up into class in the mornings, and Mr. West, who was the teacher, would say, all right, boys, field trip today. Off you go. Get as far away from this classroom as you can. And that was it. Off they'd go. And Jonathan said him and his mate would go down the road, and they would hitch a lift and get in a long-distance lorry, a driver going long distance. Didn't know where he was going. Just knew had to get as much miles between himself and the classroom as possible, and thought this was fantastic. Here he had the freedom of the open road. He saw vast swathes of countryside that he'd never have seen. He felt alive with excitement and freedom. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine teachers getting away with that now? No. Except maths teachers, maybe. Oh no, I didn't say that. Anyway, Jonathan got as far as Norwich. Yeah? People in from Norwich? Yeah? Is that in Wales or somewhere? I don't know. I'm no good at geography. Anyway, he got one day, his school was in Sidcup, and he got as far as Norwich. And he was absolutely thrilled to bits. Now, what he had to do, though, when he got as far away as he could, he had to phone Mr. West up. Mr. West said, give me a ring when you get there, and you can reverse the charges. I don't know if you remember reversing the charges. This was before we had mobile phones. But you could make a telephone call from a telephone box, looked like this, years ago, and the operator would intercept and ask the person on the other end if they would pay for your call. So it went like this. Jonathan phoned up Mr. West, and the operator said, hello, is that Mr. West of Highfield School? Mr. West said, yes. The operator said, Mr. West, I have a reverse charge call from Norwich from a Jonathan Marshall. Will you accept the charge? Mr. West said, no. Put the phone down, and then he wrote down, J. Marshall, Norwich, and knew where everybody had been. And then Jonathan had to find his way back again. And Jonathan has still, all these years later, really, really fond memories of those days. And he went on to become somebody who traveled the world, who was never afraid to go into new territories, get out of his comfort zone. He met his wife, Gillian, and they've been on numerous expeditions, and she comes from Norwich, actually. And they are now, in fact, just planning their trek to the Everest Base Camp. And I think either Mr. West couldn't stand children, and he was a really rubbish teacher, or he knew something about learning. And I believe the latter. I think he knew that we learn and we grow by doing things, not by being told stuff, not by giving reasons and rationality. We learn by experience. And that's the first of the behavior change principles that I want to talk to you about today. I'm just going to talk about 3 principles that I've gleaned over years and years as a psychologist of trying to understand how people change and how we work. And I think we learn and we grow, we develop by doing new things, not by thinking or reasoning, by having real experiences that exist outside of our normal range. And yet, what do businesses do when they want to grow and develop people? They do the equivalent of putting them in a classroom. They send them on a training course, put them on a workshop, might give them some e-learning. What happens? What happens when we're exposed to those things is that we're not actually changing our behavior. We go on a course, or our employer can then tick the box that we've done that training. But then we go back to our desks and think, okay, now where was I? What was I doing before I was so rudely interrupted by that workshop? I'll get back to my job now. And we snap back to doing what we always did. Change is very difficult. And the reason we go back to doing what we always did is because the brain is a habit machine. The brain consists of 100 billion neurons. It's a fantastic habit machine. Whenever we learn something, we create connections between these neurons. Okay, and we create connections. The more we do something, the more neurons the brain assigns to that action. And with repetition, the connection between those neurons becomes stronger and stronger until we have a neural pathway. And what you saw there was information traveling down a neural pathway, because the stronger it becomes, it increases the likelihood of that pathway being used again and again and again. So whenever we come up against a situation that we think we've got the answer for, we activate the same neural pathways. And that's what we're up against when we're trying to change behavior. We're up against a brain that is hardwired for inertia. And no amount of thinking or reasoning or appealing to rationality is going to change that brain. It's action, it's behavior that makes a difference. And so we came up with Do Something Different as a way of giving people the actions that are associated with any learning. And we put it online and we distribute actions, behaviors to people to say, yes, you know the reasons, now go and do this. Do this today. Do that tomorrow. And it might pop up in their email or on their phone, but it's all about behavior. We had one guy, his name was Tom, who was an engineer at a company who were going through a lot of changes. Tom was only 42. He looked a lot older. He had a lot more grey hairs than perhaps he should have done because he was struggling, he was very stressed, and not only was work difficult because of imminent redundancy and lots of pressure, but home was tough for Tom as well. He was married to Hazel. He had 3 boys, 9-year-old twins, and he had a 7-year-old boy, Daniel, who suffered with autism. As any of you will know, that can be very, very challenging and demanding. And Tom had kind of got into a habit of finding life difficult, but getting home from work and feeling quite stressed out and pulling up outside his own house, and on the one hand thinking, yeah, I'm home, great, end of the day. But on the other hand thinking, what am I going into? Because very often he would go home and Hazel, his wife, would be at the end of her tether, perhaps in floods of tears, beside herself because of things that the children had been doing that day, particularly Daniel, who refused to eat his food or had locked himself in the bathroom or had bitten his teacher. It seemed there was always something. And Tom was coping with this by, well, not coping actually. He was going in, sitting down, turning on the TV, watching the news, and kind of just letting it all go over his head because he felt helpless. He didn't know what he could do. Anyway, Tom's company put him on a stress program. It was a Do Something Different stress program, so he didn't go on a course or anything. He just started to receive do's every couple of days to give him different things to do. And one day, this popped up on his phone. It just said, "Do go for a 15-minute walk at lunchtime or after work today." That's all. Looks so simple. And Tom thought, when he got home that day, I'll try it. He went in, he showed Hazel the do on his phone. That gives him permission to do something different. He changed his jacket, he changed his shoes, put on his walking boots, and he went out for a walk. And it was one of those nice evenings that we're going to start to get now, aren't we, in October, where we get brilliant sunsets. And he was walking towards the fields behind his house, and he thought, this is good. I'm getting a feeling I'm enjoying this. And he decided to do it more often. He made a new habit of doing it every day after work. And then one day after work, when he was changing into his jacket and his walking boots, he noticed on the floor, by the back door, there was a little pair of trainers and a little kind of kiddie's hooded jacket, type they wear when they go out to play. And as Tom went out for his walk, Daniel trotted along behind him. And they walked in silence for a long time, for about the first 10, 12 minutes, and then Daniel spoke to Tom. He told him about something that happened at school today. That had never, ever occurred before. For the first time, Tom had something nearing a conversation with his child. That was a breakthrough moment, and it led to other breakthroughs. It led to better relationships at home, in the family, and Tom found that he coped better at work. What Tom discovered is that it's really hard to make big, sweeping changes in your life, especially when you've got a lot of crap going on in your life. It's really difficult. But what you can do is you can start to make small changes to behavior. You can start to disrupt habit patterns. And if you start to make small changes by doing something different, you create a ripple effect. You don't know necessarily what the consequences will be, but you can guarantee that if you did nothing, nothing would change. But you do something, and there's a good chance that you'll get something different. So, in order to change behavior, we have to break down old habits. In that case, all Tom had to do was just to stop ignoring what was going on and adopt a new behavior. We have to do something different. And small changes, although they may seem incredibly simple at first, can make big differences. And they're doable. They don't require willpower or a huge attitude shift. They're small things that are doable in our everyday life. So we had another guy on a Do Something Different course. His company instigated a Do Something Different program for bias and inclusiveness, to make staff more inclusive in their relationships. This guy was Stephen. And Stephen was tough, decisive. He knew where he was going in life. He made sure he was going to get there. And he had got there. He'd been incredibly successful. He was director of operations in a very large organization. And part of our Do program, every Do program, is that we try to get people to become more behaviorally flexible. By that I mean, we all have behaviors that we use regularly all the time. They become hardwired into our brains. But we have a lot of behaviors that we never use, which could serve us well. So, Stephen was preparing for a very important strategy meeting one day with senior staff in his organization, and he knew he had to drive through a new strategy, but he was very confident that he could win everybody over and move on to implement it. And then, just as he was preparing to go into the meeting, he gets this Do on his phone. It says, Do, try out your unassertive side today. For example, stay quiet in a meeting. Hold back, let others have their say. Well, Stephen showed this to a colleague and who told us what he said when he received it, which I won't repeat here, but basically it was Why on earth would I want to be unassertive? He actually used the phrase, I didn't get where I am today by being unassertive, okay? He prided himself on his assertiveness. But the colleague who knew something about Stephen said to him, look, you brought into this program. Why don't you just give it a whirl? And he did. Stephen went into that meeting and at first he had to put his hand over his mouth, bite his tongue. He was desperate to jump in. But then he just sat and watched and observed. And two guys were in that meeting who he thought he knew well. He thought one was really on his side, completely on his wavelength, really on board as far as the strategy was concerned. And the other guy he thought was a bit of a lightweight and probably quite ineffectual. When he sat back and didn't jump in and didn't put forth his own views and didn't try to dominate the whole meeting, he found that he learned something about these two guys, that the one that he thought was on his wavelength actually started talking, and he let him keep talking, and the guy went on and practically hung himself. And the other guy, who he thought was ineffectual and a lightweight, he came up with the probing questions. He came up with some real insights, and eventually out of it came some really good ideas that would never have occurred to Stephen. So, what Stephen discovered is that if you keep reusing the same behavior trait that you think has got you to where you are, you'll only just stay where you are. You won't learn, you won't grow, you won't develop, and you may miss out on a whole host of new ideas and new opportunities that are there, but you're not seeing them because you're being a habit machine, because you're being behaviorally inflexible. Basically, you'll stay on that same brain pathway and you'll stop growing. And that's why we always get people on our DO programs to try another behavior. And we have a very clever diagnostic on the online system, which was developed here in Brighton, I'm pleased to say, that will identify the gaps that people have in their behavioral profile. It'll find out which behaviors they're not using, and it'll make them use them. It will send them those do's. It'll say, just try this today. Give it a whirl. See what happens. And then the ripple effect takes over. So these behavioral flexibility programs help us to grow and develop whatever it is that we're aiming to accomplish, whether we want to be less stressed, whether we want to improve relationships, deal with companies with leadership, green behavior, bias and diversity. Happiness is a recent one which we're working on. We always include the principle that if you just have one behavior, it's like going around with a hammer and approaching every job that you come up with against with a hammer. It'll do for some jobs, but for other jobs, it'll create a right cock-up. Yeah? Behavioral flexibility is like going through life with a full toolbox. So whatever situation you come up against, you know that you've got the tool for the job. Because just having that hammer means you're going to keep doing the same thing. You're going to use those same pathways, same way you went to work. You're going to read the same newspaper. You're going to trot out the same old solutions to problems. You're never going to learn and grow and develop. And this, to me, is what behavior change is all about. So to change behavior, we have to expand the person's behavioral repertoire. Have to grow their toolkit so they become more behaviorally flexible. And we do that one do at a time. And the beauty of this is that we now know there are those lovely pathways again, same old brain pathways, but what is now known is that thanks to non-invasive neuroimaging techniques, we can now look at the brain and we know a lot more about its structural plasticity. That is the ability of the adult brain to change, to reorganize, and to form new connections. And thanks to neuroscientists, originally this was a guy called Bogdan Draginsky at the university in Germany who discovered this, and brain science has come on in leaps and bounds ever since. The adult brain can change. It can rewire itself. But you know how those new connections get formed? They get formed from actions, from doing things, not from thinking, not from rationality or reason. It all starts with a behavior. Of course, cognitive change follows on, because once you've done something different, you have new insights. That's when your thinking changes. But a lot of the mistakes that have been made in the past have been to try to change people's thinking, and as a result, hope that they will change their behavior. Assume that if you send them on a course, they will then go and do the right thing. But no, we change behavior first, then people have personal insights, and then we see cognitive change. It's like CBT, but turned on its head, really. And this is so powerful. So I started off, and I've been saying to you that we don't change people by just talking to them. And I'm standing here talking to you, so I've got to practice what I preach. Yeah? I can't personally do a diagnostic on all of you, although I did one or two of you over coffee. You didn't know, did you? But I want you to think about, what do you like on one dimension? Let's take systematic and spontaneous. Okay? You might think you can be a bit of both, but you probably have a leaning either to being very systematic or to being very spontaneous. How many of you would say you lean more towards the systematic side? Yeah, okay. A lot of men. And how many of you think you're probably more spontaneous? Okay, that's good. That's about 50-50. But to really experience do something different, you've got to take something that you're not and try it. So if you said you were spontaneous, try being systematic. Look at the do's on the left-hand side of that screen and select one. If you said you were systematic, look at the do's on the right-hand screen, right-hand side of the screen, and select one. And just resolve to do it. Just give it a whirl over the next day or two. And we usually give people 1 to 2 days to do a do. It's a small action. You don't know where it's going to lead, but do something that feels a little bit uncomfortable as well. Don't pick the easy thing. We want to push you a little bit off that old brain pathway into activating wider regions of your brain, and you'll only do that by doing something different. So write it down now, the one that you are going to do. Put it in your phone. If you're very systematic, you'll have an alarm that reminds you, which we like. If you're spontaneous, write it on a paper aeroplane and throw it at yourself. It doesn't matter. Try it. Resolve to just give it a whirl and see what happens. Because it's outside of your usual behavior where the magic happens. It's out on the open road. We all need somebody like Mr. West in our brains saying, just go out there, get as far away from your normal self as you possibly can. Yeah? And then, have you all resolved to do one? Yeah, good. Will you do it? Yes. Starting today. That's so cool. And then, this is my thank you to you for listening and for being a great audience, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And your final do, when you leave, when you go out of this room, 2 of my glamorous assistants, Ray and Anthony, will be standing at the door. They'll give you a card that says thank you. It'll have a stamp on it. And what I'd like you to do is to write that card to somebody who's made a difference to you in your business, somebody who's made an impact on you, somebody that you've been meaning to thank and have perhaps taken for granted, just somebody who's done something for you in your life. You're going to thank them in an unconventional way, and it's going to feel quite uncomfortable for some of you. But I would say just do it. Just give it a whirl and just see what happens, because that's what doing something different is all about. Thank you.